This is a story about refining and defining this method of making hollow, lightweight, durable sculptures using plaster molds and making a bigger sculpture than I had made before using this technique. It's the third or the fourth sculpture that I had made using this method, and it's a much bigger sculpture than what I had worked on before, but it's not a giant sculpture. Later on, I will make giant sculptures. It's also a story about making Pride, which is the third or fourth sculpture that I had made using this technique. It's a sculpture about me loving my body. And we'll also have short asides where we go into the house and see what my husband is working on. So let's jump right into the story. Anna here is layering craft paper into the plaster molds of the feet. We're going to start with the feet because that's the way that I make the internal structure, by drilling through the bottoms of the feet and putting nuts and bolts in there along with threaded rod that end up holding up the legs and the entire sculpture. She's putting in 3 layers of craft paper over the edges of the mold, and then I think for the feet 2 or 3 more layers of craft paper just in the inside from that edge down to make the feet very stable. That if I put more than 3 layers of paper there on that edge and then I have to cut it later, it becomes very difficult to cut. Each sculpture that is one figure only has 6 molds. The torso mold, 1 mold that contains the hands, 1 mold that contains the feet, 1 mold that contains the legs, 1 mold that contains the arms, 1 mold that contains the head. I also figured out that if I have parts that go to, like the hands for instance, if I have to take off a finger, it's best to put that finger into the same mold with the 2 hands. A while back, we made the sonotube base for this sculpture, and Rogelio made me the top and bottom plugs for the sonotube base. Before putting together the sculpture, I wanted to place the feet on the base and make sure that they're exactly where I want them, and I drilled holes to put bolts and the threaded rod through. I'm using the bolts at the ball of the foot because I found that the feet were lifting up like this on some of the other sculptures, and there was air in between the base and the foot, and I really hate that. Here in the subtropics at this time of the year, the sculptures stay a little bit wet. So I have to wait at least 2 days in order to take off the binder clips and be able to cut the flanges. I do have the warming cabinet, so that helps, but it still takes about 2 days. That reminds me that the paper paste should be put on in small coatings and not in big chunks because it will mold before drying out. Then I start putting the feet together. I roll out coils of paper paste and I paint in PVA glue, and I use that paper paste on each side of the foot in order to join the feet together. The paper paste has to be a little above the level of the joint of the foot, but not out into the flange. If the paper paste goes out into the flange, then it defeats the purpose of having a thin flange because you have to cut that as well. I was using spring clamps to clamp these pieces together, and one of my viewers had a brilliant idea of using binder clips. Thank you. Let's take a moment to see how Rogelio is starting his project. We had originally used yellow on the inside of the tower, and the stair railings and windows were violet. And after a while, we really didn't like it. So Rogelio is now putting on a sealer in order to do Venetian plaster in a different color. Besides using nuts and bolts on the balls of the feet, I use washers on the heel of the foot, the biggest washer that I can fit in there, so that the nut doesn't tear the paper out. And look, he's got on part of the first coat. I've cut off the flanges and I'm filling the mold lines with a little bit of paper paste. And over the paper paste directly, I'm using PVA glue and small pieces of craft paper. This is what summer in the subtropical fog forest looks like. Now Anna's layering in the craft paper onto the legs. The legs I make a little bit thicker, so it's again 3 coats over the edge, making the flange, and then 4 or 5 coats of paper just inside the piece. It does take quite a lot of push me, pull me to get them out always. It takes a lot of patience. Even though we put in a coat, a good coat of wax with aguaras. My next step is to attach the backs of the legs. The mortise and tenon joints in this case are working out really well. I don't always do a good job of making the mortise and tenon joints, but in this case I did. Oh, it's very beautiful. Wow, look at that. Very beautiful, honey.
Good. It's not done. One more coat.
Okay, good. I got myself a long rod so that I can shove paper paste down inside of legs or wherever I need to, when I need to reach down into those long spots on the inside. And then I'm putting in another thin-ish layer of paper paste into the heel of the foot inside in order to strengthen and hold that bolt there that's inside. And then putting in nuts and washers in 2 places, just above the ankle and mid-thigh, in order to later be able to tack the paper legs onto those bolts. I'm using paper paste to do that too, as well as PVA glue. The other sculpture is here because I wanted to see the tilt of the legs and the torso before I put the whole thing together. And I keep test fitting and test fitting. God, that's gorgeous. In the US, they call it Venetian plaster, and here they call it diamond finish. Then I tack the insides of the back of the legs to the washers that I had put in earlier, and with PVA glue and with paper paste, and put a little bit more paper paste inside the foot and then paper paste on the outside of that tenon joint, and I can't remember which is the mortise and which is the tenon. Okay, so anyway, putting the paper paste onto the outside of the bottom of the leg, and then PVA glue on the inside of the ankle and shoving it in, and then there's a little bulge of paper paste where the paper paste bulges out on the outside. So I'll fix that, repair that, get a little water on my finger and rub it down so it's nice and smooth. So I started putting the legs together with the help of the torso. There's just the right amount of space in here. I don't know how dry any of this is. I'm gonna keep working on this. I'm gonna put the front of the legs on here. If it's too wet to cut the flanges, then I'll put all this stuff into the drying cabinet. In a few days, I'll be able to put the whole thing together. So the other thing that I did is I took the feet and the legs off of the final base, but I have the measurements from the final base here. And I just don't wanna get the final base all messed up before I paint it. Anyway, let's go to work. I don't know what happened to the footage of me putting the fronts of the legs on. I'll blame the camera. I forgot to mention that on the fronts of the legs, I also put PVA glue and paper paste, and inside of the foot where the front of the leg goes, I put PVA glue and paper paste so that it can sit in there very solidly as well before I attach the whole thing together. This is a shot from above, me doing more tacking into the top of the thigh. I hope you liked this video, and I hope you come back for the next part where I continue working on pride.